Judged according to our works, I Corinthians 3:10-15. By Pastor John Frederickson. There is an ancient story about an owner of a vast empire with many servants. When he determined to go on a journey, the owner summoned several of his servants and entrusted much of his wealth to them. When the owner returned, he required his servants to report what kind of returns they gained. Several gained much and were duly praised and rewarded. But one had done nothing but secure the initial capital entrusted to him. The owner rebuked this servant for his sloth, seized his capital, and punished his servant. This illustration, based on the parable of the talents Matthew 25:14-30, loosely parallels some aspects of the coming Bema seat. Unfortunately, some think of the judgment seat of Christ as little more than an award ceremony with no mention of one's sins. Their premise is that only our work will be judged. I Corinthians 3:13-15, which they define as only inferior efforts, or workmanship, for Christ. But God defines works as any action, either good or bad. More often than not, God uses the word work as an obvious equivalent to sin. The evil Alexander the coppersmith did toward Paul was called works, for which the Lord will reward him in eternity. 2 Timothy 4:14. The works of the flesh, in Galatians 5:11, can only be categorized as sins, and not merely an inferior effort. Paul also told believers at Rome to cast off the works of darkness, Romans 13:12. While each of us may only want reward for faithful service for Christ and hope that our sinful choices after salvation will be absent, it simply will not work that way at the Bema seat. Paul tells us that all are, good or bad, will be manifest and judged at the judgment seat of Christ, 2 Corinthians 5:10. We will each give account of himself to God, Romans 14:12, and the gravity of this reality is intended to motivate us to greater responsibility now on this side of eternity. 2 Corinthians 5:11. To be perfectly clear, this biblical description is not about punishment for sinful conduct after salvation. It is about responsibility and accountability for one's actions when standing before the Savior. God provides this sober picture of the Bema seat to convince us to not take a flippant attitude toward sinful actions after salvation. Instead, with carefulness and a grateful heart, we are to build a life of good works, Ephesians 2:10, that glorify the Savior. How can you do so today?